The North American F86 Sabre, also known as the Sabrejet, a transonic jet fighter aircraft produced by North American Aviation. The Sabre is best known as the United States' first swept-wing fighter that could counter the insidious swept-wing Soviet MiG-15 in high-speed dogfights in the skies of the Korean War. Fighting some of the earliest jet-to-jet battles in history and considered one of the best and most important fighter aircraft in that war, the F-86 is also rated highly in comparison with fighters of other eras. Although it was developed in the late 1940s and was outdated by the end of the 1950s, the Sabre proved versatile and adaptable and continued as a frontline fighter in numerous air forces. Its success led to an extended production run of more than 7,800 aircraft between 1949 and 1956 in the United States, Japan, and Italy. In addition, 738 carrier-modified versions were purchased by the US Navy as FJ2s and 3s. Variants were built in Canada and Australia. The Canadair Sabre added another 1,815 aircraft and a significantly redesigned CAC Sabre, sometimes also known as the Avon Sabre, had a production run of 112. The Sabre is by far the most produced Western jet fighter, with a total production of all variants at 9,860 units. North American Aviation had produced the propeller-powered P-51 Mustang in World War II, which saw combat against some of the first operational jet fighters. By late 1944, North American proposed its first jet fighter to the US Navy, which became the FJ-1 Fury. It was an unexceptional transitional fighter that had a straight wing derived from the P-51. In early 1945, North American Aviation submitted 4 designs. The USAAF selected one design over the others and granted North American a contract to build 3 examples of the XP-86 experimental pursuit. Deleting specific requirements from the FJ-1 Fury coupled with other modifications allowed the XP-86 to be lighter and considerably faster than the Fury, with an estimated top speed of 582 miles per hour versus the Fury's 547 miles per hour. Despite the gain in speed, early studies revealed the XP-86 would have the same performance as its rivals, the XP-80 and the XP-84. Because these rival designs were more advanced in their development stages, it was feared that the XP-86 would be cancelled. Crucially, the XP-86 was not able to meet the required top speed of 600 miles per hour. North American had to quickly devise a radical change that could leapfrog its rivals. The North American F86 Sabre was the first American aircraft to take advantage of flight research data seized from the German aerodynamicists of the end of World War II. These data showed that a thin, swept wing could greatly reduce drag and delay compressibility problems that had bedeviled fighters such as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning when approaching the speed of sound. By 1944, German engineers and designers had established the benefits of swept wings based on experimental designs dating back to 1940. A study of the data showed that a swept wing could solve their problem, while a slat on the wing's leading edge that extended at low speeds would enhance low-speed stability. Because development of the XP-86 had reached an advanced stage, the idea of changing the sweep of the wing was met with resistance from some senior North American staff. Despite stiff opposition, after good results were obtained in wind tunnel tests, the select wing concept was eventually adopted. Performance requirements were met by incorporating a 35-degree swept-back wing using modified NACA 4-digit airfoils, NACA 0009.5-64 at the root and NACA 0008.5-64 at the tick, with an automatic slat design based on that of the Messerschmitt ME-262 and an electrically adjustable stabilizer, another feature of the ME-262A. Many Sabres have the 6-3 wing, a fixed leading edge with a 6-inch extended cord at the root and a 3-inch extended cord at the tick, retrofitted after combat experience was gained in Korea. This modification changed the wing airfoils to the NACA 0009-64 modified configuration at the root and the NACA 0008.1-64 mod at the tick. The XP-86 prototype, which led to the F-86 Sabre, was rolled out on the 8th of August 1947. The first flight occurred on the 1st of October 1947 with George Welch at the controls, flying from Muroc Dry Lake, now Edwards Air Force Base, California. The United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command had F-86 Sabres in service from 1949 to 1950. The F-86s were assigned to the 22nd Bomb Wing, the 1st Fighter Wing, and the 1st Fighter Interceptor Wing. The F-86 was the primary U.S. air combat fighter during the Korean War, with significant numbers of the first 3 production models seeing combat. The F-86 Sabre was also produced under license by Canadair Limited as the Canadair Sabre. The final variant of the Canadian Sabre, the Mark VI, is generally rated as having the best and highest capabilities of any Sabre version. The F-86A set its first official world speed record of 671 miles per hour on September 15, 1948 at Muroc Dry Lake, flown by Major Richard L. Johnson of the United States Air Force. 5 years later, on the 18th of May 1953, Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to break the sound barrier, flying a one-off Canadian-built F-86 Sabre Mk3 alongside Chuck Yeager. Colonel K.K. Compton won the 1951 Bendix Air Race in an F-86A with an average speed of 553.76 miles per hour. On the 2nd of February 1958, a team of Pakistan Air Force F-86 Sabres called Falcons set a world record at PAF Air Base Masroor by performing a loop while in a 16-aircraft diamond formation. The team was led by then Wing Commander Zafar Massoud. The F-86 was produced as both a fighter interceptor and fighter bomber. Several variants were introduced over its production life, with improvements in different armament implemented. The XP-86 was fitted with a General Electric J35C3 jet engine. This engine was built by GM's Chevrolet division until production was turned over to Allison. The General Electric J47 GE7 engine was used in the F-86A1. The fighter bomber version, the F-86H, could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, including an external fuel-type tank that could carry napalm. Unguided 2.75-inch rockets were used on some fighters on training missions, but 5-inch rockets were later carried on combat operations. The F-86 could be fitted with a pair of external jettisonable jet fuel tanks, 4 on the F-86F beginning in 1953. That extended the range of the aircraft. Both the interceptor and fighter bomber versions carried 6 0.50-inch M3 Browning machine guns with electrically boosted feed in the nose. Firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, the 0.50-inch guns were harmonized to converge at 1,000 feet in front of the aircraft using armor-piercing and armor-piercing incendiary rounds, with 1 armor-piercing incendiary tracer for every 5 AP or API rounds. The API rounds used during the Korean War contained magnesium, which were designed to ignite upon impact but burned poorly above 35,000 feet as oxygen levels were insufficient to sustain combustion at that height. Initial planes were fitted with the Mark 18 manual ranging computing gun sight. The last 24 F-86A5 NAS and the F-86Es were equipped with the A1CM gun sight AN/APG-30 radar, which used radar to automatically compute a target's range, which later proved to be advantageous against MiG opponents over Korea. The Sabre's swept wings and jet engine produced a flying experience that was very different from the propeller-driven fighters of the time. The transition from props to jets was not without accidents and incidents, even for experienced fighter pilots. Early on in the jet age, some U.S. manufacturers instituted safety and transition programs where experienced test and production pilots toured operational fighter squadrons to provide instruction and demonstrations designed to lower the accident rate. Additionally, the ongoing technical development and long production history of the F-86 resulted in some significant differences in the handling and flying characteristics between the various F-86 models. Some of the important changes to the design included the switch from an elevator/stabilizer to an all-flying tail. Each of these design changes impacted the handling and flying characteristics of the F-86, not necessarily for the better. In the case of the solid leading edge and increased internal fuel capacity, the design change produced increased combat performance but exacerbated a dangerous and often fatal handling characteristic upon takeoff if the nose were raised prematurely from the runway. This over-rotation danger is now a major area of instruction concern for current F-86 pilots. The 1972 Sacramento Canadair Sabre accident, resulting in 22 fatalities and 28 other casualties, was a result of over-rotation on takeoff. During the Korean War, the F-86 entered service with the United States Air Force in 1949, joining the 1st Fighter Wing's 94th Fighter Squadron and became the primary air-to-air jet fighter used by Americans in the Korean War. While earlier straight-wing jets such as the P-80 and F-84 initially achieved air victories when swept-wing Soviet MiG-15 was introduced in November 1950, it outperformed all UN-based aircraft. In response, 3 squadrons of F-86s were rushed to the Far East in December. Early variants of the F-86 could not outturn MiG-15s, but they could outdive them. The MiG-15 was superior to early F-86 models in ceiling, acceleration, rate of climb, and zoom. With the introduction of the F-86F in 1953, however, the two aircraft were more closely matched, with many combat-experienced pilots claiming a marginal superiority for the F-86F. The heavier firepower of the MiG and many other contemporary fighters was addressed by Project Gun-Thao, which saw the combat testing of 7 F-86Fs, each armed with 4 20mm T-160 cannons. Despite being able to fire only 2 of the 4 20mm cannon at a time, the experiment was considered a success and signaled the end of the decades-long use of the Browning 50 caliber in the air-to-air role. The MiGs flown from bases in Manchuria by Chinese, North Korean, the Soviet DVS pilots were pitted against 2 squadrons of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, forward based at the K-14 Kimpo, Korea. In October 1951, the Soviets managed to recover a downed Sabre, and in their investigation of the type, they concluded that the Sabre's advantage in combat was due to the APG-30 gun sight that facilitated accurate fire at longer ranges. Many of the American pilots were experienced World War II veterans, while the North Koreans and Chinese lacked combat experience, thus accounting for much of the F-86's success. However, United Nations pilots suspected many of the MiG-15s were being flown by experienced Soviet pilots who also had combat experience in World War II. Former communist sources now acknowledge Soviet pilots initially flew the majority of MiG-15s that fought in Korea, and dispute that more MiG-15s than F-86s were shot down in air combat. Later in the war, North Korean and Chinese pilots increased their participation as combat flyers. The North Koreans and their allies periodically contested air superiority in MiG Alley, an area near the mouth of the Yalu River, the boundary between Korea and China, over which the most intense air-to-air combat took place. Although the F-86A could be safely flown through Mach 1, the F-86E's all-moving tailplane greatly improved maneuverability at high speeds. The MiG-15 could not safely exceed Mach 0.92, an important disadvantage in near-sonic air combat. Far greater emphasis has been given to the training, aggressiveness, and experience of F-86 pilots. American Sabre pilots were trained at Nellis, where the casualty rate of their training was so high they were told, "If you ever see the flag at full staff, take a picture." Despite rules of engagement to the contrary, F-86 units frequently initiated combat over night bases in the Manchurian sanctuary. The needs of combat operations, balanced against the need to maintain an adequate force structure in Western Europe, led to the conversion of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing from the F-80 to the F-86 in December 1951. 2 fighter bomber wings, the 8th and 18th, converted to the F-86F in spring of 1953. No. 2 Squadron, South African Air Force SAAS, also distinguished itself flying F-86s in Korea as part of the 18 FBW.
When the Sabre F-86 came along, I mean, it was just the epitome of a beautiful airplane that handled just so well, especially in and out of the traffic pattern, and of course it did a very good job.
On the 17th of June 1951, at approximately 0130 hours, Suwon Air Base was bombed by 2 Polycarbov PO-2 biplanes. Each PO-2 dropped a pair of fragmentation bombs. One scored a hit on the 802nd Engineer Aviation Battalion's motor pool, damaging some equipment. 2 bombs burst on the flight line of the 335th Fighter Interceptor. By the end of hostilities, F-86 pilots were credited with shooting down a whopping 792 MiGs, for a loss of only 78 Sabres in air-to-air combat, a victory ratio of 10-1. Thus, 41 American pilots earned the designation of ace during the Korean War. All but one flew the F-86 Sabre, the exception being a Navy Vought F-4U Corsair night fighter pilot. However, after the war, the United States Air Force reviewed its figures in an investigation codenamed Sabre Measure Charlie and downgraded the kill ratio of the North American F-86 Sabre against the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-15 by half. Internally, the United States Air Force accepted that its pilots in fact downed 200 MiGs. According to Soviet data, the Soviets lost 335 MiG-15s in Korea to all causes, including accidents, anti-aircraft fire, and ground attacks. Chinese claims of their losses amount to 224 MiG-15s in Korea. North Korean losses are not known, but according to North Korean defectors, their Air Force lost around 100 MiG-15s during the war. Thus, 659 MiG-15s are admitted as being lost, many of these to F-86 Sabres. Soviets claim to have downed over 600 Sabres, together with the Chinese claims 211 F-86s shot down, although these cannot be reconciled with the number of Sabres recorded as lost by the United States. The status of many claimed air-to-air victories in the Korean War has been increasingly debated as more data becomes available, showing that instances of overclaiming abounded on both sides. The research by Dorr Lake and Thompson claimed that an F-86 kill ratio was closer to 2-1. A recent RAND report made reference to a recent scholarship of the F-86 versus MiG-15 combat over Korea and concluded that the actual kill-loss ratio for the F-86 was closer to 1.8-1 overall, and likely closer to 1.3-1 against MiGs flown by Soviet pilots. However, this ratio did not count the number of aircrafts of other types, including the B-29, A-26, F-80, F-82, F-84, and Gloucester Meteor, shot down by MiG-15 pilots. Data matching with Soviet records suggests that US pilots routinely attributed their own combat losses to landing accidents and other causes. According to official US data, the USAF lost 250 F-86 fighters in Korea. Of these, 184 were lost in combat, 78 in air-to-air combat, 19 by anti-aircraft guns, and 26 to unknown causes, and 61 were quote-unquote other losses, and 66 in incidents. South African Air Forces lost 6 F-86s in the war. This gives 256 confirmed F-86 losses during the Korean War. In addition to its distinguished service in Korea, the United States Air Force's F-86s also served in various stateside and overseas roles throughout the early part of the Cold War. As newer Century Series fighters came online, F-86s were transferred to the Air National Guard, or the ANG. UNIS were the air forces of allied nations. The last ANG F-86s continued to be used in the US until 1970. Given recent events in Taiwan, it is worth noting the Republic of China Air Force of Taiwan was an early recipient of surplus USAF Sabres. From December 1954 to June 1956, the ROC Air Force received 160 ex-USAF F-86F-1NA through F-86F-30NA fighters. By June 1958, the National Chinese had built up an impressive fighting force, with 320 F-86Fs and 7 RF-86Fs having been delivered. Sabres and MiGs were shortly to battle each other in the skies of Asia once again in the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis. In August 1958, the Chinese Communists and the People's Republic of China attempted to force the nationalists off of the islands of Quemoy and Matsu by shelling the blockade. Nationalist F-86Fs flying combat air patrol over the islands found themselves confronted by communist MiG-15s and MiG-17s, and numerous dogfights resulted. During these battles, the nationalist Sabres introduced a new element into aerial warfare. Under a secret effort designated Operation Black Magic, the US Navy had provided the ROC with AIM-9 Sidewinder, its first infrared homing air-to-air missile, which was just entering service in the United States. A small team from VNF 323, a Marine FJ-4 Fury squadron with later assistance from China Lake and North American Aviation, initially modified 20 of the F-86 Sabres to carry air sidewinders on underwing launch rails and instructed the ROC pilots in their use flying profiles with USAF F-100s simulating the MiG-17. The MiGs enjoyed an altitude advantage over the Sabres, as they had in Korea, and communist Chinese MiGs routinely cruise over the nationalist Sabres, only engaging when they had a favorable position. The Sidewinder took away that advantage and proved to be devastatingly effective against the MiGs. The F-86 would also play on the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 stage. In 1954, Pakistan began receiving the first of a total of 120 F-86F Sabres. Many of these aircraft were F-86 F-35s from USAF stock, but some were from the later F-86 F-40 and A production block, made specifically for export. Many of the 35s were brought up to 40 standards before they were delivered to Pakistan, but a few remained. The F-86 was operated by 9 Pakistan Air Force squadrons at various times. The Sabre was no longer a world-class fighter due to availability of supersonic jets. However, many sources state that the F-86 gave the PAF a technological advantage. In the air-to-air combat of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, the CAC Sabre is claimed to have shot down 15 Indian Air Force aircraft, compromising 9 Hunters, 4 Vampires, and 2 Nats. India, however, admitted a loss of 14 combat aircraft to the PAF's F-86s. The F-86s of the PAF had the advantage of being armed with AIM-9B GAR-8 Sidewinder missiles, whereas none of its Indian adversaries had this capability. Despite this, the Indian Air Force claimed that 7 F-86 Sabres were shot down by Furland Nats, and 6 F-86 Sabres were shot down by Hawker Hunters. The aircraft remained a potent weapon for use against ground targets. On the morning of the 6th of September, 6 F-86s of the No. 19 Squadron struck advancing columns of the Indian Army using 15-inch rockets, along with 6 50-inch N3 Browning machine guns. On the same day, 8 F-86 fighters of the same squadron executed an attack against the IF Pathankot. No. 14 PF Squadron earned the nickname Tally Choppers for their successful attack against the Indian bomber base in Kalaikonda. The PAF claims to have destroyed around 36 aircraft on the ground at various Indian airfields. However, India only acknowledges 22 aircraft lost on the ground to strikes partly attributed to the PAF's F-86s and its bomber, Martin B-57 Canberra. The F-86 would also see itself play a role in the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. The Canadair Sabres Mark VI, acquired from ex-Luftwaffe stocks by Iran, were the mainstay of the PAF's days fighter operations during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 and had the challenge of dealing with the threat from the IAS. At the beginning of the war, PAF had 8 squadrons of F-86 Sabres. Along with the newer fighter types such as the Mirage 3 and Shenyang F-6, the Sabres were tasked with the majority of operations during the war. In East Pakistan, only one PAF F-86 squadron, the 14th Squadron, was deployed to face the numerical superiority of the IAF. In the Battle of Boida, Indian fallen Nats of the 22nd Squadron IAF shot down 2 F-86Es and severely damaged 1 F-86E. PAF F-86s performed well, with Pakistani claims of downing 31 Indian aircraft in air-to-air combat. These included 17 Hawker Hunters, 8 Sukhoi Su-7 fitters, 1 MiG-21 and 3 Nats, while losing 7 F-86s. The most interesting of these was a battle between 2 Sabres and 4 MiG-21s. 1 MiG was shot down without any Sabres lost. This was achieved due to the greater low-speed performance of the Sabre in comparison to the Delta Wing MiG-21. India, however, claims to have shot down 11 PAF Sabres for the loss of 11 combat aircraft to the PAF F-86s. The IAF numerical superiority overwhelmed the sole East Pakistan Sabre Squadron and other military aircraft, which were either shot down or grounded by Pakistani fratricide as they could not hold out, enabling complete air superiority for the IAF. After this war, Pakistan slowly phased out its F-86 Sabres and replaced them with Chinese F-6, Soviet MiG-19 based fighters. The last of the Sabres were withdrawn from service in the PAF in 1980. They are now displayed in the Pakistani Air Force Museum and in the cities in which their pilots lived. The F-86 would also play a role in the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence. In 1958, the Força Aérea Portuguesa (FAP) received 50 F-86Fs from ex-USAF stock. A few former Norwegian Air Force F-86Fs were also purchased as spares in 1968. The FAP deployed some of its F-86F Sabres to Portuguese Guinea in 1961, being based at AB2, Redesigned Air Base, Bissau. These aircraft formed Detachment 52, initially equipped with 8 F-86Fs, and from the Esquadra 51 based at the BA-5 Montereal Air Base. These aircraft were used in the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence in the ground attack and close support operations against the insurgent forces. In August 1962, 5314 overshot the runway during an emergency landing with bombs still attached on underwing handpoints and burned out. F-86F 5322 was shot down by enemy ground fire on the 31st of May 1963. The pilot ejected safely and was recovered. Several other aircraft suffered from combat damage but were repaired. In 1964, 16 F-86Fs based at Vissalangat returned to mainland Portugal due to US pressure. They had flown 577 combat sorties, of which 430 were ground attack and close air support missions. On the other hand, the Philippine Air Force PAF first received the Sabres in the form of F-86Fs in 1957, replacing the North American P-51 Mustang as their primary interceptor. F-86s first operated at Basa Air Base, known infamously as the Nest of Vipers, where the 5th Fighter Wing of the PAF was based. Later on, in 1960, the PAF acquired the F-86D as their first all-weather interceptor. The most notable use of the F-86 Sabres was in the Blue Diamonds aerobatic display team, which operated 8 Sabres until the arrival of the newer supersonic Northrop F-5s. The F-86s were subsequently phased out of service in the 1970s, as the Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter and Vought F-8 Crusaders became the primary fighters and interceptors of the PAF. Antonio Bautista was a Blue Diamonds pilot and a decorated officer. He was killed on the 11th of January 1974 during a combat sortie against rebels in the south of the country. During the Korean War, the Soviets were searching for an intact US F-86 Sabre for evaluation and study purposes. Their search was frustrated largely due to the US military's policy of destroying their weapons and equipment once they had been disabled or abandoned. In the case of US aircraft, USAF pilots destroyed most of their downed Sabres by strafing or bombing them. However, on one occasion, an F-86 was downed in the tidal area of a beach and subsequently was submerged, preventing its destruction. The aircraft was ferried to Moscow, and a new OKB, Soviet Experimental Design Bureau, was established to study the F-86, which later became part of the Sukhoi OKB. Quote, at least one F-86 was sent to the Soviet Union. The Russians admitted, and other planes and crises such as the US G-suits and radar gun sights also went. End quote. The Soviets studied and copied the optical gun sight and radar from the captured aircraft to produce the AS-34N gun sight and the SRC-30 radar. Installed in the MiG-17, the gun sight system was later used against American fighters in the Vietnam War. The F-86 studies also contributed to the development of aircraft aluminum alloys such as B-95. The old but nimble MiG-17 had become such a serious threat against the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief over North Vietnam that the United States Air Force created Project Feather Duster to test which tactics supersonic American fighters could use against fighters such as the MiG-17. ANG F-86H units proved to be an ideal stand-in for the Soviet jets. One pilot remarked, "In any envelope except nose down and full throttle, either the F-100 or F-105 was inferior to the F-86H in a dogfight." Dominant in dogfights more than half a century ago, the North American F-86 Sabre reigned long before fighters were designed to be so twitchy that pilots needed computers to fly them. US and Royal Air Force pilots have called the F-86 the best handling fighter of its time, and today pilots fly it at air shows. So if you want to fly a Sabre, how hard can it be? You'd certainly need experience flying a high-performance jet, says Steve Carrick, who flew F-15s in the Gulf War and is now one of 2 Federal Aviation Administration examiners for Sabre pilots. After that, he says, it's actually a fairly easy plane to fly, but you'd want to step your way up to it. You'd want to fly the T-33 first. If you can fly that, it's a natural stepping stone to the F-86. Carrick is a first officer with United Airlines, and a demonstration pilot with the Warbird Heritage Foundation, a group formed to preserve military aircraft in flying condition. He says, if you're a civilian and you wanted to get checked out, you go to someone who trains on 2-seat MiG-15s Then get ground training and prepare for a practical test, he says. Then someone like me would mentor you through. The examiner would do either a ground observation or a chase flight. The furious pace of Cold War weapons development ensured the North American F86 Sabre burned briefly but brightly, ceasing production at the end of 1956, just 9 years after George Welch's first test flight of the XF-86. But North Americans' plants in Los Angeles and Columbus churned out roughly 6,000 of the F-86's A through K variants during that period. Nothing is more beloved than a machine that does its job, and Michael Hankins, National Air and Space Museum curator of Air Force history, says that the Sabre did a fine job. Although its often cited 10-to-1 kill ratio is probably inflated, he says that 5 or 6-to-1 is reasonable, given that US pilots enjoyed a greater skill advantage over Chinese and North Korean MiG jockeys than they did against better-trained Soviet pilots in the earlier war. With a half-dozen 50-caliber M3 machine guns, the F-86 had a bite to match its bark, which came from a General Electric J-47 engine. That power plant drove the F-86A to a world speed record of 671 miles per hour on September 15, 1948. In 1952, the F-86D would improve upon that with a 698 mile per hour run, before becoming the first fighter to use a speed record to itself when the F-86D was clocked at 715 miles per hour the next year. The air superiority arms race that would run for 40 years was just getting started, but the Sabre gave the US an early and oft-proven advantage. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.